My husband texted me from Cancun. I ran away with your best friend. We are never coming back. I replied, good luck. I canceled every card and changed every lock. The next morning, the police knocked on my door. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your entire world flipped upside down in the middle of the night. My name is Diana. I am 33 years old, and until a few days ago, I thought I understood the man I had been married to for 5 years. We lived in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Chicago. Greg was a senior portfolio manager at a prestigious wealth management firm downtown. Our marriage had been fraying at the edges for months. He worked late, took sudden weekend business trips, and grew increasingly defensive whenever I asked simple questions. The reality beneath our picture-perfect life was far more sinister than a simple office romance. The night everything shattered began in absolute silence. It was 2 in the morning. I was sitting in my home office on the second floor. The house was completely dark save for the cool blue glow of my 3 computer monitors. I work as a senior forensic auditor for a federal contractor, a job that requires intense concentration and often keeps me up long after the city has gone to sleep. Greg had told me he was attending a mandatory financial conference. He packed his bags 2 days prior, kissed my cheek, and promised to call when he landed. I was deep into analyzing a complex web of shell companies when my phone vibrated on the desk. The sudden buzzing shattered the quiet of the room. Instead, Greg's name flashed across the display. I opened the message. The words were blunt, careless, and devastating. I am in Cancun with Amber. We are in love. I drained the accounts. We are never coming back. I stared at the glowing letters. Amber was my closest friend. We had known each other since college. She had stood beside me at my wedding holding my bouquet while I exchanged vows with the man who was now texting me from a beautiful tropical beach with her. The double betrayal should have brought me to my knees. I should have collapsed onto the floor in tears. But I did not cry. I did not panic. A strange icy calm washed over me, sharpening my senses and narrowing my focus. I read the text one more time, absorbing the sheer arrogance of his words. He genuinely believed he had won. He believed he had left me destitute and broken, completely powerless to stop him. I typed a simple 2-word reply. Good luck. I pressed send and set the phone face down on the desk. Then I turned my attention back to my 3 monitors. Greg thought he knew everything about our finances. He handled his firm's money, so he naturally assumed he was the smartest person in the room regarding our personal wealth. But he fundamentally misunderstood what I did for a living. I dismantled financial structures for the federal government. Within 60 seconds, my hands were flying across my keyboard. I logged into our banking portals and completely locked down every shared credit line, canceling the cards he had taken with him. I restricted access to the joint savings even though he claimed to have drained them. Then I opened the security application for our home. With a few clicks, I deactivated his access codes, wiped his biometric data from the system, and changed the smart locks on every door of the house. He was officially locked out of our life. Satisfied that the immediate bleeding was stopped, I closed my laptop, walked down the hall to my bedroom, and climbed into bed. The silence of the house felt different now. I closed my eyes and surprisingly managed to fall asleep. The tranquility did not last. At exactly 6 in the morning, a violent, rhythmic pounding echoed through the house. It was not the polite knock of a delivery driver or the hesitant tap of a neighbor. It was the heavy, authoritative strike of someone demanding immediate entry. I threw off the covers, grabbed my robe, and hurried down the stairs. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. As I approached the entryway, the pounding resumed, shaking the heavy wooden door in its frame. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Standing on my porch were 3 men in dark suits, their expressions grim and unyielding. The man in front held up a gold badge. Detective Harrison, Financial Crimes Unit. He announced, his voice carrying the hard edge of authority. We are looking for Greg. My husband is not here, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. He sent me a message a few hours ago stating he was in Mexico. The detective did not look surprised. In fact, his gaze hardened as he looked me up and down. He slapped a thick stack of papers onto the console table in my foyer. "I do not care about your marital issues," Harrison said sharply. "I care about the $4.5 million missing from your husband's wealth management firm." I looked at the paperwork. It was a federal search and seizure warrant. The numbers leaped off the page, confirming a massive, systematic drain of corporate funds. "Greg did not just empty your personal accounts." Harrison continued, his tone dripping with accusation. "He orchestrated a massive embezzlement scheme. The stolen funds were wired directly into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. An account that bears your forged signature as the primary beneficiary." The magnitude of Greg's betrayal finally crystallized. He had not just run away with my best friend. He had not just stolen our savings. He had methodically framed me as the mastermind of a federal crime to cover his own tracks. He intended to live a life of luxury in Cancun while I took the fall and went to federal prison. "You are a primary suspect in a major federal investigation," Harrison warned, stepping further into my home. "Your passport has been flagged. Your assets are frozen." The detective clearly expected me to break down. He expected tears, panicked denials, and desperate pleas of innocence. Instead, I looked down at the forged banking documents sitting on my console table. I traced the routing numbers with my eyes, recognizing the familiar pattern of a hastily constructed offshore shell company. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The icy calm from the night before returned stronger and more absolute than ever. "Detective," I said smoothly, "you are looking at the wrong offshore routing number." Harrison frowned. "Excuse me." I turned toward the staircase, gesturing for him to follow. "My husband thinks I am just a quiet accountant who balances checkbooks," I told him. "He thinks he outsmarted his firm and left his unsuspecting wife holding the empty bag. Let me show you what my husband does not know I do for a living. I have the exact digital evidence to prove it to you right now, hidden securely on my own encrypted servers upstairs." Detective Harrison narrowed his dark eyes but nodded. He signaled the two officers to wait by the front door and followed me up the staircase. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet, but his heavy boots thudded with every step. We walked straight to the solid core door at the end of the hall. I pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner next to the frame. The lock clicked, and I pushed the door open to reveal my workspace. The room was cold, kept at exactly 68 degrees to prevent the tower servers from overheating. The 3 curved monitors on my desk cast a pale blue light across the walls. Harrison stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the server rack, the power supplies, and the hard drives stacked neatly on the metal shelving. He looked at me, clearly reevaluating the woman standing before him in a silk bathrobe. I pulled up my desk chair, sat down, and entered a long alphanumeric password, followed by a secondary authentication token generated by an app on my secure phone. The screen unlocked, displaying a cascading wall of transaction logs and network topographies. "My husband thinks I am a data entry clerk for a boring accounting firm," I said, keeping my eyes on the screen as I pulled up a specific encrypted file directory. "He thinks I spend my days organizing receipts and checking spreadsheets for tax compliance. The truth is, I am a senior forensic IT auditor for a private intelligence firm contracted by the Department of the Treasury. My entire career revolves around hunting down hidden assets, tracing laundered cartel money, and building digital cages around people who think they can outsmart the federal government." Harrison stepped closer to the desk, his skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. "And you are saying you tracked your husband stealing $4.5 million from his own firm?" I caught the initial anomaly. Exactly 3 weeks ago, I explained, clicking open a visual timeline I had built. Greg had become sloppy. He started taking unannounced weekend trips and working late, which made me suspicious of an affair. I decided to run a quiet diagnostic on his personal devices and our home network router. I expected to find hotel receipts or text messages to Amber. Instead, I found a hidden virtual private network tunneling directly into his wealth management firm's highly secure administrative portal. I pointed to a cluster of red nodes on the monitor. Greg was bypassing his firm's security protocols to create phantom client portfolios. He was slowly siphoning funds from high-yield accounts, moving the money in increments small enough to evade automated detection, and pooling it into a central holding account. He planned to execute one massive wire transfer to an offshore bank in the Cayman Islands, drain the holding account completely, and disappear. And to make sure nobody chased him, he forged my signature on the digital incorporation documents for the offshore shell company. He set me up to be the sole target of the federal investigation. Harrison crossed his arms, his jaw tight. He succeeded in making you the target. That wire transfer went through at 1 in the morning. The money is in the Cayman Islands and your name is all over it. I smiled again, turning to look the detective directly in the eyes. That is where Greg made his fatal miscalculation. He assumed he was the smartest person on the network. But once I mapped his embezzlement scheme 3 weeks ago, I did not confront him. I did not file for divorce. I simply waited for him to initiate the final transfer, and I set a digital trap. I brought up a new window on the center monitor. It displayed a highly complex routing path, showing the origin of the funds, the encrypted transit protocols, and the final destination. I pointed to the final destination routing number. Greg authorized the wire transfer to the Cayman Islands account he set up under my name. But he did not realize that I had already infiltrated his hidden laptop. I rewrote the underlying script of his transfer protocol. When he hit execute at 1 in the morning, the system displayed the Cayman routing number on his screen, but the actual destination was overwritten. "Where did the money go?" Harrison asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he leaned over my shoulder to read the code. "It went exactly where I told it to go," I replied, tapping the screen. I rerouted the entire $4.5 million into a secure Internal Revenue Service honeypot account. It is a locked federal evidence vault used specifically for seizing laundered funds. The money never left United States jurisdiction. It never touched the Cayman Islands. It is sitting safely in federal custody right now, completely inaccessible to Greg or anyone else. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the cooling fans in the server tower. Harrison stared at the screen, reading the confirmation codes and the federal vault routing numbers. He pulled a small notebook from his breast pocket, compared the numbers I displayed against the warrant in his hand, and slowly let out a long breath. "You intercepted a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement scheme from your home office," Harrison stated, shaking his head in disbelief. "You let your husband think he got away with it just so he would leave the country and lock himself out of the funds." "I did not just let him think he got away with it," I corrected gently. "I gathered the undeniable proof needed to clear my name. The data packets include the IP addresses of his devices, his unique keystroke logging, and the biometric timestamps of when he initiated the transfers. Everything you need to prove he acted alone and framed me is right here on this drive." Harrison ran a hand over his face, processing the massive shift in the investigation. He pulled out his phone and stepped back from the desk. "I need to call the bureau director and verify these routing numbers immediately. If what you are showing me is authentic, the warrant for your arrest is void. But you need to understand something very important." The detective's expression darkened, returning to the grim, hardened look he wore when he first knocked on my door. Greg did not pull off a $4.5 million heist without inside help. There are safety mechanisms at his firm that require dual authorization for transfers of that magnitude. He has powerful accomplices, people who expect a cut of that money. Right now, they think the money is safe in Mexico. When they realize the accounts are empty and the feds have the cash, they are going to panic. And when they panic, they are going to come looking for the person who set the trap. You just put a massive target on your own back. "I am fully aware of the risks, detective," I replied, my voice unwavering. "But I refuse to be the scapegoat for my husband's greed." Harrison nodded slowly. "Do not leave this house. Do not contact anyone. I am going out to my vehicle to make this call on a secure line." He turned and walked out of the room. The front door bursts open. It is not an accomplice. It is my mother, Helen, and my golden child sister, Courtney, holding a pre-written confession. My mother marched into my foyer with the righteous indignation of a woman whose country club tea time had been delayed. She did not ask about the federal agents who had just vacated my driveway. Instead, she marched straight up to my console table and slapped a thick sheaf of legal documents down next to the federal search warrant. Courtney trailed close behind, clutching a designer handbag to her chest. My younger sister looked immaculate, her blonde hair perfectly blown out, entirely unfazed that it was barely past 7 in the morning. Helen did not bother saying hello. She pointed a sharp fingernail at the documents. "Sign these, Diana," she commanded, her voice echoing against the high ceilings. I read over them on the drive here. It is a standard admission of guilt. If you sign it now, Greg's lawyers can present it to the district attorney before this mess goes public and ruins our family name. I stared at my mother, wondering for a fraction of a second if the stress of the morning had caused me to hallucinate. "You want me to confess to a federal crime I did not commit?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "A crime that Greg orchestrated on his own before running off to Mexico with my best friend." Helen scoffed loudly, waving her hand dismissively in the air, as if a $4.5 million embezzlement was a minor parking infraction. "Oh, please do not play the victim here, Diana. We all know you drove him to this. You completely emasculated that poor man with your nerdy computer job. You sit up in that dark office all night typing complicated code instead of being a proper wife. A man like Greg needs warmth and affection, not a federal contractor who treats her marriage like a sterile data spreadsheet." Courtney nodded in fervent agreement, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. "Exactly," she chimed in, her tone dripping with superiority. "Amber told us absolutely everything." My head snapped toward my sister. "Amber." I repeated the name, tasting like ash in my mouth. "You spoke to the woman who destroyed my marriage." Helen stepped in, lifting her chin defensively. "Amber called me from Cancun an hour ago. She was practically in tears, Diana. She said Greg had to rescue her from your toxic behavior. She told me how controlling you have become, how you track every penny he spends, and how he finally had to take back what was rightfully his just to start over and find some peace. She is terrified of you. We all are, frankly. You have always been so cold and calculating. Greg simply took the money to secure a fresh start because he knew you would have left him with nothing if he had asked for a divorce." I looked from Helen to Courtney and finally understood that neither of them cared whether I was innocent. To them, my career, my freedom, and my reputation were expendable if sacrificing me protected the family name and preserved Courtney's wedding. The realization hurt, but it also clarified everything. I had spent years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided I was disposable. I reached out and picked up the thick stack of legal papers my mother had brought into my home. Helen's eyes gleamed with smug triumph, clearly assuming I had finally submitted to her authority, just as I had done when I was a child. Instead of searching for a pen, I gripped the crisp white pages firmly with both hands. I stared directly into my mother's eyes as I deliberately tore the heavy confession packet perfectly in half. The sharp ripping sound echoed in the quiet foyer, making Courtney jump back with a startled gasp. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, then again, reducing the meticulous legal document to worthless pieces of confetti. I walked over to the console table, picked up my half-empty coffee mug from earlier that morning, and dropped the shredded pieces of paper directly into the dark liquid. The ink immediately began to bleed, turning the water into a murky gray sludge. Helen's face contorted with absolute unadulterated fury. Her perfectly manicured facade cracked completely, revealing the viciousness underneath. "You will regret this!" she snarled, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. She plunged her hand into her designer purse and pulled out her cell phone. "You think you are so smart, Diana, but you have no idea who you are dealing with. I am calling Greg's aggressive defense attorney right now. He is a ruthless man who destroys people for a living. If you will not sign the confession voluntarily, we will legally force you out of your own house before the day is over." Helen tapped her phone screen, pressing the speaker icon like a weapon. A voice barked through the speaker. "Marcus, Diana is refusing to sign," Helen snapped. "She destroyed the documents. We need to move to the next step immediately." Marcus Vance Gregg's aggressive defense attorney did not ask to speak to me. He simply began broadcasting his threats. "Listen carefully, Diana," he stated. "You are occupying a property financed using marital funds. Under state law, your husband has every right to liquidate shared assets to secure legal representation. Gregg authorized me to seize the house. If you do not sign that confession, I will file an emergency eviction notice before noon. You will be out on the street by the weekend." Courtney let out a soft, delighted laugh. "I told you to just sign it," she whispered, her eyes shining with malicious glee. "Now you are going to lose the house anyway. You really should learn when to surrender." I addressed the phone. "Mr. Vance, I assume a lawyer of your caliber would verify ownership records before threatening to seize property over a phone call." There was a tense pause. I reviewed the marital assets, Diana, he countered. "The property is your primary residence. Gregg has been paying the utility bills for 5 years. That makes it a commingled asset subject to liquidation." I turned and walked into the adjacent study. Helen and Courtney followed. I walked over to the heavy steel filing cabinet, unlocked the bottom drawer, pulled out a manila folder and walked back to face them. I extracted a notarized document. "Allow me to save you the filing fee, Mr. Vance," I said. "This house was purchased entirely in cash exactly 3 years before Gregg and I met. Furthermore, my name is not actually on the deed. The property is owned entirely by an independent private trust, established solely for my benefit. Gregg never contributed a single cent to the principal or the trust itself. Legally, he has absolutely zero claim to this house, and neither do you." The silence across the phone line was profound. Marcus Vance was scrambling, realizing he had been fed bad information. Gregg assumed he was entitled to half of everything simply because we were married, but I never commingled my premarital assets. My federal background taught me to secure my foundation long before I let anyone else build upon it. Courtney frowned, her smug expression faltering. "What does that mean?" she demanded. Marcus Helen snapped into the phone. "You said we could force her out." The attorney cleared his throat, pivoting instantly. "Fine," Vance snarled. "Keep the house. But you are not walking away from this untouched, Diana. My client is facing a massive federal investigation triggered by your reckless meddling in his firm's secure networks. You are a federal contractor. Your entire career relies on a pristine security clearance. If you do not take responsibility for the missing funds, I will file a massive civil lawsuit against you for defamation. I will claim you orchestrated a smear campaign against Gregg to hide your own cybercrimes. The moment that lawsuit hits the public docket, your federal agency will automatically suspend your security clearance pending a review. You will lose your job, your income, and your reputation. You will have absolutely nothing left." Helen smiled, vicious satisfaction returning to her features. "You see, Diana," my mother said, "you cannot win against us. Gregg has the best legal team money can buy. We have the social connections to make sure you never work in this city again. Take the blame for the missing money. It is the only way you can save yourself from complete public ruin." Courtney nodded eagerly. "It is the best thing for the family," she added. "You do not want to ruin my wedding with all this nasty legal drama." They stood there in my home, genuinely believing they had cornered me. They thought the threat of losing my career would force me to take the fall for a man who had stolen millions and run away with my best friend. They expected me to crumble. I looked at the two of them, realizing how little they truly understood about the situation. They were playing a game of social manipulation, completely unaware that the board had already been flipped. Before I could respond, a melodic chime interrupted the tense atmosphere. The sound came from my personal cell phone resting on the glass coffee table. I walked over and picked up the device. The screen was illuminated with an incoming FaceTime request. The caller ID displayed a string of numbers indicating an international call, specifically from a Mexican area code. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. The timing was absolutely perfect. "Who is calling you right now?" Helen demanded, her voice shrill with annoyance. "Tell them you are busy dealing with your lawyer." "I am not dealing with my lawyer," I replied smoothly. "I am dealing with yours." I swiped my finger across the screen and activated the mirroring function on my phone. The 80-inch television mounted on the living room wall instantly flared to life, replacing the blank black screen with the incoming call display. The international number flashed in white numbers across the room. "What exactly are you doing?" Courtney asked, taking a step back as the television illuminated the space. I tapped the green accept button. The connection established with a brief digital crackle, and the television screen filled with a live video feed. The image was chaotic at first, shaking violently as the person on the other end scrambled to hold the camera steady. Then the picture resolved. It was Greg. He was standing in what looked like a lavish hotel lobby, but the luxurious background sharply contrasted with his appearance. He was heavily sunburned, his face a bright, painful red, and his usually perfectly styled hair was matted with sweat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he stared into the camera. The smug, untouchable arrogance that had characterized his departure text was completely gone. He looked terrified. His eyes darted around the lobby behind him before focusing desperately on the camera lens. "Diana!" He practically screamed, his voice echoing loudly through the speakers, drowning out the angry protests of his attorney still holding on my mother's phone. "Diana, please tell me you are there." Helen gasped, dropping her phone to her side as she stared at the television. Courtney let out a shocked squeak, her hands flying to cover her mouth. I stood in the center of the room, my arms relaxed at my sides, watching my husband unravel on the screen. "I am here, Greg," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady. "How is Cancun?" He ignored the question, his face pale beneath the harsh sunburn. "The resort just locked our doors," he begged, his voice cracking with pure panic. "They brought private security up to the room and forced us out into the lobby. Every single credit card has declined. The front desk manager says the offshore accounts do not exist. He says the routing numbers are entirely invalid." Greg pressed his hand against his forehead, looking like a man who had just watched his entire universe collapse into dust. "We have no money, Diana. We have absolutely nothing. What did you do?" I took a slow, deliberate sip from my coffee mug. The dark liquid was still warm, contrasting sharply with the ice-cold reality I was about to deliver. I looked at the 80-inch television screen, taking in every detail of my husband's frantic state. His designer linen shirt was clinging to his chest, dark with sweat, and the lush tropical plants of the Cancun lobby behind him framed his absolute terror like a tragic comedy. "Unfreeze the accounts right now, Diana," Greg demanded, stepping closer to whatever device he was using to broadcast his panic into my living room. His voice echoed off my high ceilings, raw and desperate. "I know you did this. You always have to control everything. You logged in and locked me out. Put the money back and unfreeze the cards." I set my mug back down on the glass coffee table with a soft clink. "I did not freeze your cards, Greg," I said, my tone as conversational as if we were discussing the weather. "I canceled them. All of them. The joint accounts, your personal lines of credit, the emergency funds. I even canceled your frequent flyer miles. They do not exist anymore. And neither does the $4.5 million you thought you stole from your firm." Greg stared at the camera, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled out of water. "That is impossible," he stammered, wiping a thick bead of sweat from his peeling forehead. I watched the wire transfer process. I saw the confirmation screen. "The transfer never reached the Caymans, Greg," I said. "It went directly into a federal evidence account. The money is safe, and every time-stamped device signature and authorization record points straight back to you." The color completely drained from his sunburned face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He gripped the edge of what looked like a reception desk, his knuckles turning white. "You set me up." He breathed, the realization finally penetrating his thick skull. "You set me up and ruined my life." "You ruined your own life," I replied evenly. "You just sent me a text message at 2 a.m, happily declaring that you were abandoning our marriage to sleep with my best friend." Greg sneered, a flash of his old arrogance pushing through the sheer terror. "Do not pretend you are some innocent victim here, Diana. You owe me this money. You owe me my freedom. I gave you the best 5 years of my youth, and what did I get in return? A cold, sterile house, and a wife who prefers staring at encrypted spreadsheets over paying attention to her husband. Amber actually makes me feel like a man. She appreciates me. I had to leave. I deserved a fresh start, and taking that money was the only way to get it, because you never would have let me walk away with what I am owed. His justification was so profoundly twisted that I felt a genuine twang of pity for his delusion. He genuinely believed that my dedication to my career justified federal wire fraud and infidelity. Before I could address his absurd sense of entitlement, a shrill, hysterical voice shattered the background noise of the resort lobby. Amber shoved her way into the video frame. She was wearing a sheer white beach cover-up and oversized designer sunglasses pushed up into her tangled blonde hair. Her face was streaked with running mascara, and she was gripping Greg's arm with bruising force. "Greg, you have to do something right now!" Amber screamed, her voice bordering on a full-blown shriek. "The resort manager is walking back over here. He told his security guards to take our passports. They are holding our luggage in the back room until we settle the bill." Amber looked directly into the camera, her eyes wide with a very real, very dangerous kind of fear. "Diana," she pleaded, her previous role as the triumphant mistress completely evaporating. "Diana, please, you have to wire us some cash. Just enough to pay the hotel bill so we can get to the airport. You do not understand the kind of place Greg brought me to. This is not a normal tourist resort." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my absolute stillness. "What kind of resort is it, Amber?" "It is an exclusive private compound," she babbled, looking frantically over her shoulder. The manager told Greg that they cater to high-level cartel members. The men sitting in the VIP lounge have armed guards standing outside their cabanas. They do not care about credit card errors. The manager said, "If we do not produce $20,000 in cash to cover our suite and the damages from the locked accounts, they are going to hand us over to their private security detail to work off the debt. They are going to make us disappear, Diana. Please." The sheer gravity of their situation was staggering. Greg had tried to play the role of a high-rolling billionaire booking a suite at a resort that operated entirely outside the bounds of normal law, assuming his stolen millions would protect him. Now he was stranded in cartel territory with zero assets, canceled credit cards, and a massive debt to people who did not issue polite billing statements. "Oh, Gregory, honey!" my mother suddenly wailed, lunging forward. Helen pushed past me, her manicured hands grasping desperately toward the television screen as if she could physically pull him through the glass. Her maternal instincts, completely absent when I was facing a federal raid just an hour prior, were now in overdrive for the man who had betrayed me. "Diana, give me your phone," Helen demanded, turning to me with wild, furious eyes. "Unfreeze those accounts right this second. He is terrified. Amber is terrified. You cannot just leave them down there to be murdered by a cartel. Have you lost your mind? Give me the phone so I can tell him it will be okay." I calmly stepped sideways, keeping the phone well out of my mother's reach. "I am not unfreezing anything," I said, my voice echoing through the living room. "The money is in federal custody. I could not move it even if I wanted to, which I absolutely do not." Courtney stepped up beside our mother, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "You are a monster, Diana," she spat, glaring at me. "You are actually going to let them die just because you are jealous that Greg chose Amber over you. This is exactly why he left you." On the screen, Greg was hyperventilating. He was pacing back and forth in a tight, panicked circle, completely ignoring Amber, who was now sobbing loudly into her hands. The reality of federal prison on one side and cartel enforcers on the other was actively breaking his mind. "Diana, you have to fix this," Greg pleaded, leaning so close to the camera that his bloodshot eyes filled the entire screen. "The feds cannot have that money. You have to hack back in and move it. If the feds trace that honeypot account back to the original loan disbursements, they are going to see the entire paper trail. They are going to see the fraudulent collateral." I frowned, my forensic instincts flaring instantly. "What fraudulent collateral, Greg? You transferred liquid cash from your firm." He shook his head violently. sweat flying from his hair. No, no, you do not understand how we got the initial capital to cover the margins. I needed a massive collateral backer to bypass the firm's security triggers before I could move the 4.5 million. I could not use my own name. I needed someone with an established corporate footprint. My blood turned to ice. A cold, heavy dread began to pool in the pit of my stomach. Who did you use, Greg? He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward my mother, who was still standing defensively in front of the television. I used Richard, he blurted out, his voice cracking with pure desperation. Your father. Richard co-signed the original fraudulent loans using his dealership as the collateral backing. He knew about the scheme, Diana. He helped me set it up. If the feds trace that money, they are not just going to arrest me. They are going to arrest your father. The living room plunged into a deafening, suffocating silence. Helen froze, her hands suspended in the air. Courtney's mouth dropped open in shock. I stood completely paralyzed, the air trapped in my lungs as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me. This was not just a cheating husband acting alone. My own father had financed the embezzlement that was meant to send me to federal prison. My entire family was complicit in the federal crime. I disconnected the call. The screen went black. The silence was deafening. I turned to face my mother and sister. Helen had gone rigid, the color drained from her face. Courtney gripped her bag until her knuckles turned white. Get out, I said. My voice was dangerously quiet. Helen blinked, trying to recover her commanding posture. Diana listened to reason. Your father is a respected man. You cannot possibly turn him over to federal authorities. Get out, I repeated. If you do not leave right now, I will call the police. Helen opened her mouth to argue, but my glare stopped her cold. She grabbed Courtney by the arm and pulled her toward the foyer. They scrambled out the door without another word. I slammed the door shut behind them, throwing the deadbolt. The betrayal throbbed in my chest. My own father had financed the embezzlement scheme meant to send me to prison. I grabbed my trench coat and snatched my car keys from the silver bowl. I had to look Richard in the eyes and see the man who sold his daughter. The drive to the dealership took 20 minutes. I drove with mechanical precision. Richard had owned it for 30 years. It was the crown jewel of our family. As I pulled into the customer lot, the signs of financial distress were glaringly obvious. The inventory was remarkably sparse. The gleaming rows of luxury sedans were gone, replaced by wider spaces to make the lot look fuller than it was. The showroom windows desperately needed a cleaning. I walked through the double doors. The sales floor was eerily quiet. A few salesmen stood around in cheap suits looking anxious and bored. They barely glanced at me as I marched straight past the reception desk and headed for the executive suites. His office was located at the end of the hall. I pushed the solid mahogany door open and stepped inside. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, staring intensely at a computer monitor. He was a tall, imposing man who took great pride in his appearance, but today he looked diminished. His expensive tailored suit hung loose on his frame, and the deep lines around his mouth bespoke months of severe stress. He looked up, startled by my entrance. Diana, he said quickly, minimizing a window on his screen. What are you doing here? I thought you were dealing with that misunderstanding with Greg. It is not a misunderstanding, Dad, I replied, walking forward until I stood directly in front of his desk. I kept my posture straight and my expression blank. I know exactly what happened. I know about the $4.5 million. I know Greg transferred it to an offshore shell company in my name. And I know you provided the corporate footprint to collateralize the initial fraudulent loans. Greg called me from Mexico 30 minutes ago in a panic. He confessed to absolutely everything. Richard stared at me. The polite paternal mask he usually wore completely dissolved, leaving behind a cold, calculating businessman. He did not attempt to deny the accusations. He did not feign ignorance or express shock. He simply let out a heavy sigh and leaned back in his leather executive chair, folding his hands over his stomach. Greg is a fool for calling you Richard, stated his tone conversational. But since you already know, there is no point in pretending. The dealership has been drowning for 2 years, Diana. The supply chain issues destroyed our profit margins, and the banks were calling in our commercial loans. We were facing total bankruptcy. I was going to lose everything. Greg came to me with a solution. He needed a corporate entity to bypass the security algorithms at his wealth management firm. I provided the backing, and in exchange, he funneled the liquid cash directly into the dealership's operating accounts. It was a beneficial arrangement. I stared at him, feeling a physical wave of nausea wash over me. "You helped him steal millions of dollars," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You helped him forge incorporation documents in my name. You knew he was framing me for federal wire fraud. You knew I would go to prison for this." Richard waved his hand in the air, a gesture of profound dismissal. "Prison is an exaggeration, Diana. With your clean record, you would have gotten probation, maybe a few years in a minimum security facility at worst. You need to look at the bigger picture here. This business is our legacy. It pays for your mother's lifestyle. It is paying for your sister's wedding. We needed that cash to survive. You sacrificed my freedom for a failing car dealership." I demanded, the sheer horror of his justification ringing in my ears. Richard slammed his open palm against the mahogany desktop. "Stop being so dramatic," he barked. "I need you to be a good daughter for once in your life and take the hit. You sit around playing with computers while Courtney is actually building a future. What do you actually have to lose, Diana? You are a barren dropout. You could not even give Greg a child. You do not have a real legacy to protect. Your little government contractor job means absolutely nothing compared to the survival of this family business. Your reputation is an acceptable casualty." The cruelty of his words struck me like a physical blow. He was weaponizing my painful struggles with infertility, throwing my deepest vulnerabilities in my face to justify his own criminal actions. He saw me as entirely expendable, a defective product that could be discarded to save the things he valued. The man sitting across from me was a parasite. "I am leaving," I stated, my voice dropping to a dead, icy whisper. "And I am driving straight to the federal building to hand over all the digital evidence I have collected. I am going to watch the federal agents dismantle this dealership piece by piece. You are going to die in a federal prison, Richard." I turned on my heel, ready to walk out the door and burn their entire world to the ground. "Wait," Richard commanded, his voice suddenly very calm, very assured. I stopped, refusing to turn around. "We have nothing left to discuss." "Oh, I think we do," he replied, the sound of a desk drawer sliding open catching my attention. I slowly turned my head, watching as he reached into a thick manila envelope. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it deliberately in the center of his mahogany desk. "You are not going to any federal agents, Diana. You are going to sign the confession and take the blame quietly." I stepped back toward the desk, my eyes narrowing as I looked down at the paper. It was an official federal tax document, a highly complex corporate liability form. Richard slid the fabricated tax document across his mahogany desk until it rested just inches from my hands. I looked down at the bottom line. It was a binding financial guarantee for the dealership's massive commercial debts. And there, sitting clearly on the primary guarantor line, was my signature. It was a flawless forgery of my handwriting. "You are already on the hook, Diana," Richard said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the desk, a sinister, triumphant smile spreading across his weathered face. "You have no choice." I stared at the crisp white paper, at the blue ink forming a perfect imitation of my signature. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, fully expecting me to crumble under his fabricated evidence. He thought the threat of financial ruin would break me. I looked from the forged document back to my father, feeling a freezing calm wash over my body. I picked up the tax document, folded it into thirds, and slid it into the pocket of my trench coat. Richard sat forward, his brow furrowing in confusion. "I am not signing your confession, Dad," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And I am keeping this as evidence of your attempted extortion." His face darkened, the veins in his neck bulging. "You give that back to me right now, Diana," he barked, slamming his hand down on the desk. "You cannot walk out of here with that. It is a legally binding document." "It is a felony forgery," I corrected him, stepping backward toward the door. And it is exactly what I need to prove you and Greg conspired to frame me. I turned the brass handle and pulled the door open. Richard shouted my name, but I did not stop. I marched past the stunned salesman, pushed through the glass doors, and walked out into the crisp morning air. I walked to my car, got in, and locked the doors. As I pulled out of the dealership lot, my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The magnitude of my family's betrayal settled heavily in my chest. My husband stole millions. My mother and sister demanded I take the fall to save a wedding. And my father forged my signature to tie me to a sinking business and a massive federal crime. They believed I was weak enough to sacrifice myself for their comfort. I drove toward my neighborhood, the silence giving me time to process the tactical reality of my situation. I needed to digitize the forged document, cross-reference the metadata from Greg's laptop, and prepare a package for the Treasury Department. I was so focused on mapping out my forensic strategy that I did not register the continuous buzzing coming from my purse. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sound was impossible to ignore. My phone was vibrating endlessly against the leather lining. I parked the car, grabbed my purse, and pulled out my phone. The screen was an avalanche of notifications. There were dozens of missed calls, hundreds of text messages, and a continuous stream of social media alerts. I unlocked the screen, tapping on a text message from a neighbor. The message read, "Diana, please tell me this is a sick joke. What is going on?" Attached to the text was a link to a public social media post. I clicked the link and my breath caught in my throat. Courtney had posted a massive statement across all her social platforms, and Helen had shared it with her entire network. The post was titled, "Praying for my sister's mental health." I stood in my driveway reading through the most vicious smear campaign I had ever seen. Courtney painted a heartbreaking picture of a family in crisis, claiming that my struggles with infertility had caused a complete psychological breakdown. She wrote that I had become dangerously paranoid, intensely jealous of her upcoming wedding, and obsessed with destroying Greg's life out of pure spite. But it was not just a narrative. Courtney attached images to the post. There were screenshots of text messages supposedly sent from my phone to Greg demanding he empty his bank accounts and threatening to ruin his career if he ever left me. The text threads were expertly fabricated, using my exact phrasing clearly dictated by Greg to make them look authentic. The fake messages portrayed me as a deeply unstable wife who had maliciously hacked into her husband's personal finances and frozen his legitimate accounts to punish him for wanting a divorce. Helen added her own comments below the post, tearfully asking the community for privacy while they tried to get me the psychiatric help I desperately needed. She claimed that I had kicked her out of my house that morning when she arrived to check on my well-being, confirming the narrative of my mental collapse. The comments section was a war zone. People from our local community, women from the country club, and casual acquaintances were tearing me apart. They called me a toxic barren monster, trying to ruin her sister's beautiful wedding out of sheer jealousy. They expressed profound sympathy for Greg, painting him as a victim who had to flee the country to escape his psychotic wife. They had completely flipped the script. While I was gathering federal evidence, they were destroying my public character, ensuring that no one in our affluent circle would ever believe a word I said. I walked slowly up the front steps, my eyes glued to the screen as new hateful comments populated in real time. They were trying to isolate me, systematically dismantling my credibility before the federal charges could even be filed. If I was viewed as a mentally unstable woman seeking revenge, any accusations I made against Greg or my father would be dismissed as the ravings of a scorned wife. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the quiet foyer, tossing my keys onto the console table. My mind was racing, calculating how to counter the fabricated texts when my phone rang in my hand. The caller ID made my stomach drop. It was Director Miller, my immediate superior at the Federal Intelligence Agency. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice completely steady, and answered the call. "Good morning, Director," I said, hoping to sound absolutely normal. "Diana, we have a massive problem. he stated, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. 10 minutes ago, our internal compliance division received a flagged alert regarding your clearance. A civil lawsuit was filed against you in state court by your husband's attorney, alleging cybercrimes, defamation, and severe financial sabotage." I closed my eyes, realizing Marcus Vance had executed his threat the exact second I walked out. "Director, I can explain everything," I started to say, but he just cut me off. "It gets worse, Diana," he continued, his tone grim and intensely professional. "The lawsuit filing included a certified tax document tying you as the primary financial guarantor to a failing commercial dealership currently under investigation for fraudulent loan practices. Given your access to sensitive Treasury data, the sudden appearance of massive undisclosed commercial debt, combined with public allegations of cyber sabotage, triggers an automatic mandatory protocol. You are a severe security risk right now." My blood ran cold. The fabricated tax document Richard had tried to use to blackmail me had already been submitted to the courts by Greg's lawyer. They had coordinated the entire assault. "I have been placed on automatic suspension, have I not?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the empty house. "Effective immediately," the director confirmed. "Your federal credentials have been deactivated. Your access to all secure networks is revoked. You are being placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full federal review of your finances and your conduct." "I am sorry, Diana. Until your name is cleared, you are completely locked out." The line went dead. I stood alone in my foyer, holding the silent phone as the full weight of their coordinated attack crushed down on me. The hardwood floor beneath my feet felt unsteady. 10 years of immaculate federal service, of climbing the ranks in the intelligence agency, of building a flawless reputation, had been dismantled in a single morning. My father and my husband had not just tried to cover their tracks. They had actively conspired to utterly annihilate my life. I walked numbly toward the kitchen, my boots clicking hollowly against the floorboards. I placed my phone face down on the granite island and pressed the heels of my hands against my closed eyes. A cold, suffocating anger began to spread through my veins, pushing past the initial shock. They thought suspending my clearance would render me helpless. They were catastrophically wrong. I still possessed the raw data proving the embezzlement and the routing history of the stolen millions. As I opened my eyes and reached for my laptop to begin compiling the encrypted files, the phone on the counter erupted in a harsh, jarring ringtone. I stared at the screen. The caller identification displayed an unknown international number. A deep, instinctual sense of dread washed over me, but my forensic training took over. I needed to gather every piece of intelligence I could get. I picked up the device, tapped the screen, and accepted the call. Amber's voice came through in a ragged whisper. The resort's security had separated her from Greg, and neither of them was being allowed to leave. I had already heard the details once, so I stopped her before she could repeat the same desperate story. "Tell me why you are really calling," I said. Amber took a shaky breath. She promised that if I helped her return to the United States, she would testify against Greg. She would confirm that he had framed me, reveal everything he had said about the offshore accounts, and identify anyone else involved in the scheme. While she begged, I opened her public social media profile on my laptop. Her latest photograph showed her lounging beside the resort's infinity pool, holding a tropical drink and smiling as if she had already won. But it was not her smile or the luxury resort that caught my attention. It was the diamond necklace around her neck. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "I am looking at your public profile right now, Amber," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You posted a photo yesterday bragging about your new luxurious life. Do you remember that post?" "Yes," she whimpered, clearly confused by the sudden change in subject. "I do not care about the photos, Diana. I am begging for my life." "You are wearing a diamond tennis necklace in that photograph," I continued, enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp precision. "It is a custom piece featuring 3 carats of brilliant cut diamonds set in white gold. My late grandmother gave me that exact necklace on my wedding day." I kept it tightly secured in my jewelry box, and I noticed it missing 3 days ago. Amber went completely silent. The hysterical sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a terrified intake of breath. You helped Greg pack his bags. I stated the cold reality of her thievery, hardening my resolve into solid steel. You went through my personal belongings and stole a family heirloom. And then you had the sheer, unmitigated audacity to wear it while sipping margaritas on a beach vacation funded by stolen money. I am not wiring you a single dime, Amber. You wanted my husband. You have him. Enjoy the cartel. Wait! Amber shrieked, the panic in her voice suddenly twisting into something dark, venomous, and incredibly hateful. You think you have this all figured out, do you not? You think you are so smart with your federal job and your forensic data. You think Greg and your father are the only ones coming for you. I paused, my finger hovering over the end call button. The sheer malice radiating from the speaker made me freeze. You are completely blind, Diana. Amber spat, her tone dripping with pure spite. Courtney and Helen did not just wake up today and decide to run a smear campaign for fun. They were ordered to do it. They are preparing the ground for your indictment. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. What are you talking about, Amber? Who ordered them? She let out a harsh, breathless laugh that sounded unhinged. You really have no idea who Courtney is marrying, do you? Her precious fiancé is not just some wealthy trust fund kid. His father is Arthur Vance. He is the presiding state judge for the entire commercial district, and he is the one quietly pulling every single string behind the scenes to make sure you take the fall. Judge Vance is protecting his own son's family wealth, Diana. He is using his judicial power to coordinate the lawsuit, the security clearance suspension, and your upcoming criminal indictment. I did not say another word. I pressed the red button, cutting off Amber's frantic breathing, and set the phone down on the granite counter. The silence in the kitchen was heavy, as the magnitude of the conspiracy settled over me. It all made sense now. The unprecedented speed of the civil lawsuit, the immediate execution of my security clearance suspension, Richard's terrifying confidence behind his desk. A standard attorney could not have pulled the levers of federal bureaucracy so swiftly, but a presiding state judge protecting his son's assets could. Judge Vance was orchestrating the assault to ensure his future daughter-in-law's family did not drag his legacy into a bankruptcy. I did not panic. The forensic analyst inside me took control. I grabbed my phone and dialed the line for Detective Harrison. He was the only investigator I trusted, the one who helped me look into Greg's routing anomalies before the trap was set. He answered on the second ring. Diana, he said, sounding like he was in a moving vehicle. I just saw the alert come across the wire about your clearance. Tell me what is happening. I am being framed, I replied, my voice steady. Greg confessed everything, but my father forged my signature on a liability document to tie me to the dealership's debt. They filed a suit to trigger my suspension. But that is not the worst part. I received a panicked call from Greg's mistress. She admitted that Courtney's future father-in-law is coordinating the legal attacks. It is Judge Arthur Vance. I heard the screech of tires as Detective Harrison slammed on his brakes. A prolonged silence followed, broken only by the thumping of his turn signal. Diana, are you certain about this? He asked, the gravity altering his tone. Judge Vance is one of the most powerful judicial figures in the state. If he is manipulating your federal triggers and burying the investigation into your father's dealership, we are dealing with systemic corruption. I am certain, I said. It explains the speed of the coordinated strike against me. Vance is protecting his son's future by making sure I take the fall for the missing millions and fraudulent loans. Harrison let out a harsh breath. We cannot fight a sitting judge without hard digital proof. A panicked phone call is hearsay. It will never hold up in court. Vance has the power to squash any subpoena, bury the investigation, and expedite your criminal indictment. We need direct evidence linking the judge to the forged tax document and the lawsuit. I paced across the kitchen floor, calculating the digital architecture of the Vance family. Arthur Vance was notoriously careful about his own digital footprint. He would not leave a paper trail on his personal devices, but his son Carter was the conduit. Carter was the one marrying my sister. Carter was the one embedded in the financial planning of the wedding. Carter Vance manages his father's digital correspondence, I said, stopping by the window. The Vances keep illicit dealings in-house. Carter uses a private encrypted server for all his communications. If Judge Vance is secretly coordinating to destroy me, the hidden emails and metadata will be routed directly through Carter's server. I need physical access to his personal phone to clone the data. Diana? That is a proximity hack, Harrison warned, his voice tight with concern. You would have to be within a few feet of his device for an extended period, connected to the same localized network. If you are caught attempting to breach a judge's server while under federal investigation, you will go straight to prison. There will be no saving you. I am already facing prison, I reminded him coldly. They left me no other choice. Before Harrison could argue further, the sound of the mail slot snapping shut echoed from the front hallway. I told the detective I would call him back and ended the call. I walked out to the foyer and looked down at the tile floor. A single envelope rested on the rug. It was made of heavy cream-colored cardstock, the kind of expensive stationery Helen insisted upon for all formal family announcements. I picked it up and broke the wax seal. Inside the layers of tissue paper was an ornate, gold-embossed invitation. The edges were gilded, and my eyes scanned the elegant cursive script printed across the front. It was a formal invitation to Courtney and Carter's lavish rehearsal dinner scheduled for this coming Friday evening at the Oakview Country Club. I stared at the heavy cardstock, a bitter smile touching the corners of my mouth. I had just been kicked out of my mother's inner circle, smeared across social media as a jealous, mentally unstable monster, and suspended from my federal career. Receiving an invitation to the most exclusive event of the wedding weekend was not an olive branch. It was a calculated trap. Helen and Courtney knew exactly what they were doing. They were sending this engraved invitation to gloat fully, expecting me to hide away in my house while they celebrated their victory. They wanted to show the country club community that they were taking the high road, inviting the troubled sister, knowing she would be too humiliated to show her face. But as I looked at the gold lettering spelling out the location, my forensic instincts flared. The Oakview Country Club. I knew that building intimately. Our family had been members there for decades. More importantly, I knew their digital infrastructure. The club was notoriously resistant to modern upgrades. They still used an outdated, unencrypted wireless network for members and guests. Carter Vance would be there. He would be connected to that unsecured network. He would be sitting in a room full of people, distracted by the toasts, the expensive champagne, and the fawning attention of my mother. His phone would be sitting right in his pocket, completely vulnerable to a proximity breach. If I could get within 10 feet of him and connect to the network, I could deploy a silent payload. I could bypass his biometric security mirror, his encrypted servers, and extract every piece of correspondence between him, his father, and my family. I could get the digital proof Detective Harrison needed to bring the corrupt syndicate down. The audacity of the plan sent a rush of adrenaline through my veins, pushing away the exhaustion and betrayal. They wanted to use this dinner to publicly humiliate me and cement my downfall. They believed I was defeated, stripped of my power, and broken by their coordinated assault. They severely underestimated the woman they were dealing with. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a black pen, and smoothed the response card flat against the granite island. My hand did not shake as I carefully checked the box marked, "Yes, I will attend." I slipped the card into the return envelope and sealed it completely shut. They had pushed me into a corner, assuming I would simply surrender, but I was going to walk straight into their trap, smile at the people who sold me out, and take back my life. Friday evening arrived with a stifling, oppressive heat that clung to the windshield of my car as I turned through the massive wrought iron gates of the Pine Valley Country Club. My secure mobile phone was resting quietly on the leather passenger seat, already running a highly sophisticated packet sniffing application in the hidden background. I had spent the last 2 agonizing days locked in my house, coding a specialized self-executing script designed to quietly infiltrate the unencrypted wireless network. The arrogant country club stubbornly refused to upgrade. It was a very risky proximity data breach, but the only alternative was letting a corrupt federal judge send me to a federal prison for crimes committed exclusively by my own father and my cheating husband. I smoothed down the soft fabric of my dress. I had chosen a black sheath dress devoid of designer labels and jewelry my family favored. I needed to blend in to look unassuming, while my device worked silently in my pocket. I slipped my phone into the pocket of the dress, verifying the script was scanning for devices, and walked up the steps toward the double doors. The moment I crossed the threshold into the expansive chandelier-lit lobby, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. The indoor air conditioning was absolutely freezing, but the sudden shocking chill had significantly more to do with the two familiar figures standing directly in my path. Helen and Richard had been waiting for me. They stood like sentinels near the grand staircase, scanning the incoming guests. The instant my mother spotted me, her eyes narrowed into sharp, dangerous slits. She grabbed Richard by the arm, and they moved with surprising speed to intercept me before I could make it past the coat check. Richard aggressively stepped right in front of me, purposefully using his broad shoulders to physically block my direct line of sight to the main ballroom, where the joyful sounds of clinking glass and loud laughter were already echoing. Helen immediately flanked him on the right, her face tightly pulled into a furious, hateful grimace. "What on earth do you think you are doing here, Diana?" Helen hissed, keeping her voice low so the passing waitstaff would not overhear. Her eyes raked up and down my simple black dress, her upper lip curling in disgust. "You actually had the nerve to show your face at your sister's rehearsal dinner, looking like a common office worker." I crossed my arms, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression as my phone vibrated once against my thigh, signaling it had successfully connected to the club's local network. "I mailed in my response card, Mom," I replied pleasantly. I checked the box that said I would attend. "I am just honoring my social commitments." Richard leaned closer, his face turning an ugly shade of red. He smelled of scotch and expensive cigars, the scent of a man celebrating a victory he had not yet secured. "You do not have social commitments anymore, Diana," he growled, pointing a thick finger at my chest. "You are a suspended federal employee under criminal investigation. You are a complete embarrassment to this family. We sent you that invitation as a formality, assuming you would have the basic decency to hide yourself away in shame." Helen stepped forward, invading my personal space until I could smell her heavy floral perfume. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "You are socially unfit to be in this building," she whispered maliciously. "The people in that room are elite. They are judges, politicians, and corporate titans. You are a paranoid, jealous woman who is currently falling apart on social media. We are not going to let you mingle with the judge's family and ruin Courtney's big night with your psychotic delusions. Turn around right now and go back to your empty house before we have security drag you out." I stood my ground, letting their insults wash over me without reacting. 5 days ago, their words would have crushed me. I would have internalized the shame, believed their toxic narrative, and quietly slipped out the door to cry in my car. But the woman they broke was gone. I was no longer the eager daughter desperate for their approval. I was an intelligence officer fighting for my freedom, and they were merely obstacles standing between me and the data I needed. My phone vibrated twice in rapid succession. The script had located the target. Carter Vance's phone was active on the network, broadcasting a distinct digital signature from somewhere deep inside the club. He was close. I looked at my father, taking in his arrogant, sneering face. Then I looked at my mother, whose eyes were wide with desperate, controlling panic. "I am not going anywhere," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, icy register. "And if you attempt to touch me or call security, I will start screaming about the $4.5 million you stole right here in the middle of this beautiful marble lobby. I will make a scene so spectacularly ugly that Arthur Vance will cancel this wedding by tomorrow morning." Helen gasped, taking a sudden step backward. Richard froze, his jaw clenching as he realized I was not bluffing. I held his furious gaze for a long moment, watching the realization dawn on him that he no longer had any power over me. Without waiting for their response, I smoothly sidestepped them, brushing past Richard's arm. I walked purposefully down the main corridor, leaving them standing speechless in the foyer. I followed the directional signal on my phone, moving away from the main ballroom and toward the secluded VIP wing of the country club. The lighting grew dimmer, the atmosphere more intimate. The heavy oak doors of the private cigar lounge were propped open. I paused just outside the entrance, listening to the booming, confident laughter echoing from within. I peeked around the doorframe. The room was thick with expensive smoke and the smell of aged leather. Sitting in the center of a plush semicircular booth was Judge Arthur Vance. He looked exactly like his political campaign portraits, silver hair perfectly styled, a heavy gold watch gleaming on his wrist. Beside him sat his son Carter, holding a crystal glass of amber liquid. A circle of wealthy, influential men surrounded them, hanging on to the judge's every word. I casually checked the active connection status on my hidden device. The wireless signal strength was absolutely optimal. I was safely and well within the required proximity radius needed to initiate the breach. I just needed to maintain this distance for exactly 3 minutes while the payload unpacked itself onto Carter's encrypted servers. I adjusted my posture, pasted a bright smile onto my face, and stepped directly into the center of the VIP lounge. The conversation abruptly died as a dozen powerful men turned to stare at the unexpected intrusion. I looked straight at the judge and his son, waving my hand with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Good evening, gentlemen," I announced, my voice loud, cheerful, and echoing clearly across the sudden silence of the room. "I am Diana, the felon of the family." The silence that followed my introduction was completely absolute. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the private lounge was the soft hum of the mahogany ceiling fans and the clinking of ice melting in heavy crystal tumblers. The wealthy, influential men surrounding the semicircular booth exchanged deeply uncomfortable glances. They were accustomed to backroom deals and quiet discretion, not brazen theatrical confrontations. Carter Vance was the first to react. He set his glass down on the polished table with a sharp, echoing thud. Courtney's fiancé was exactly as I had pictured him from the society pages, immaculately groomed, wearing a charcoal bespoke suit that cost more than most people made in a month. But the aristocratic smugness I expected was currently overshadowed by a look of sheer panicked confusion. He glanced nervously at his father, then back to me, his jaw tightening. I did not wait for an invitation. I closed the distance between us, stepping smoothly into the invisible 10-foot proximity circle required by my digital cloning script. I stopped directly in front of their table, the heavy scent of scotch and expensive cigar smoke clinging to the air. My phone rested silently in the pocket of my dress, the hidden application actively establishing a backdoor handshake with the unsecured wireless network. "I do not believe we have been formally introduced," I said, extending my hand toward Carter with a terrifyingly bright smile. "I am Diana. I hear you are marrying my sister. I wanted to extend my warmest congratulations before the federal authorities seize all of our assets." Carter ignored my extended hand. He stood up, his towering frame attempting to physically intimidate me. "You need to leave," he demanded, his voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. "This is a private event. You are not actually supposed to show up here. You are embarrassing yourself." "Oh, I think the embarrassment is entirely mutual," I replied smoothly, shifting my weight to ensure I remained planted right next to his pocket. I casually rested my left hand over my wrist, discreetly bringing my smartwatch into my peripheral vision. The tiny screen illuminated with a faint pulsing green bar. The cloning script had successfully bypassed the localized firewall. The data transfer had initiated. Progress stood at a fragile 12%. I needed to keep them talking. I needed at least 2 more minutes of continuous proximity to drain the encrypted contents of Carter's device. I heard the country club had wonderful amenities. I continued, adopting a tone of breezy, conversational, polite small talk that completely contradicted the hostility in the room. Though I must say their wireless network security is shockingly outdated. Anyone could just walk in here and connect to it. It makes you wonder how many private conversations are really private, does it not? Carter blinked, thoroughly thrown off balance by my bizarre pivot to network security. Security is going to escort you out, he threatened, reaching into his pocket for his phone. My heart slammed against my ribs. If he opened his device and noticed the sudden massive battery drain or the background network surge, the cloning process would be compromised. Before Carter could pull his phone out, Judge Arthur Vance finally moved. He placed a heavy manicured hand over his son's wrist, pressing it back down. The older man slowly stood up, smoothing the front of his jacket with calculated precision. He possessed a commanding, authoritative presence that had undoubtedly dominated courtrooms for decades. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his cold, slate-gray eyes. "Gentlemen," Judge Vance said, addressing the circle of wealthy sycophants who were awkwardly lingering, "if you would kindly excuse us, we seem to have a minor family matter that requires our immediate attention." The men murmured their hasty agreements, practically climbing over each other to escape the radioactive tension radiating from the booth. Within seconds, the three of us were completely alone in the expansive cigar lounge. Judge Vance stepped out from behind the table, moving into my personal space until we were mere inches apart. He carried an aura of absolute, unchecked power. I glanced down at my smartwatch. 38%. The progress bar was crawling with agonizing slowness. "You are a remarkably bold woman, Diana," the judge said softly, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried a subtle, terrifying edge. "I will give you credit for that, but boldness without leverage is just foolishness." "I'm just here to celebrate the happy couple," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. Judge Vance let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He leaned in closer, dropping his public facade entirely. The respectable, impartial jurist vanished, replaced by a ruthless predator. "Let us drop the theatrics," he whispered, his tone dropping to a deadly quiet cadence. "You are standing in a burning house, and you are trying to negotiate the temperature. You have absolutely no idea what kind of machinery is operating against you." I held my ground, though my pulse was racing. "I know exactly what is operating against me. I know you are manipulating the commercial district courts to protect Carter's financial future. I know you expedited the civil lawsuit to trigger my clearance suspension. And knowing that changes absolutely nothing," Vance murmured, a cruel smirk touching his lips, "you are fighting a tidal wave with a bucket. Do you truly believe you can walk into my country club, make a little scene, and walk out of here with your life intact? You are completely out of your depth." I flicked my eyes to my wrist. 65%. I needed him to keep talking. I needed to run out the clock. "You cannot bury a federal investigation forever," I challenged, keeping my voice steady. "When the intelligence agency conducts their forensic audit, they will trace the stolen $4.5 million. Your influence will not stop a federal probe." "That is where you are catastrophically wrong," Judge Vance whispered, leaning in so close I could feel the heat of his breath. "The federal probe will not find anything anomalous because the narrative has already been written. You are a disgruntled, jealous sister who embezzled funds to finance a secret life. When the money vanished, your husband bravely came forward to report you. They will believe the grand jury," he added smoothly. "I have already made the necessary calls. I have already signed off on the preliminary warrants. On Monday morning, a grand jury indictment will be formally executed. Federal marshals will arrive at your home and place you in handcuffs. You have one remaining option, Diana. You will quietly plead guilty." I checked my watch. 99%. "If you refuse," Vance sneered, "you will face maximum federal prison time." The smartwatch vibrated. The hidden data transfer completes. 100%. I smiled, stepped backward, and confidently walked outside. Safe inside my car, I opened the decrypted files. I glanced at my smartwatch and instantly realized the terrifying truth. The files contain hard proof that the judge wasn't just protecting them. He was the shadow investor who ordered Greg to steal the $4.5 million in the first place. The sheer scale of the betrayal threatened to suffocate me, but my forensic training kept my mind razor sharp. I quickly initiated a secure encrypted tunnel to my personal cloud server, uploading every single file, ledger, and communication log I had just pulled from Carter's device. I drafted an email to Detective Harrison, attached the access keys, and set a timed release. If anything happened to me tonight, federal authorities would have the entire map of the Vance syndicate by morning. I locked my phone and slipped it back into the pocket of my dress. A normal person would have driven straight to the local field office and let the agents handle the rest. But my family had made this deeply, incredibly personal. They had tried to destroy my career, my reputation, and my freedom in front of everyone we knew. I opened the car door and stepped back out into the sweltering night air. I was not leaving this country club until I finished what they started. I walked back through the heavy double doors of the Pine Valley Country Club, completely ignoring the valet who tried to ask if I needed my vehicle. The rehearsal dinner was a spectacle of obscene wealth. Towering floral arrangements dominated the center of each table. The opulence was suffocating a glittering facade, masking the ugly, rotten core of the people funding it. I stepped over the threshold and into the ballroom. My simple black sheath dress stood out starkly against the sea of pastel silks and tailored tuxedos. I did not try to blend in. I walked straight down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished dance floor. It took less than 10 seconds for the whispers to begin. Heads turned, glasses were lowered, Courtney was standing near the towering cake, holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly. When she noticed the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, she turned around. Her eyes locked onto me and the manufactured smile vanished from her face instantly. A dark, ugly flush of pure rage crept up her neck and stained her cheeks. "What are you doing in here?" Courtney shrieked, her voice slicing through the quiet room like a siren. She slammed her champagne glass down onto a nearby table, completely disregarding the expensive crystal as it shattered against the wood. "You were supposed to stay away from us. You were supposed to stay in your miserable, empty house." "I was invited," I replied, keeping my voice level and calm. I sent in my response card. Courtney marched toward me, her hands balled into tight fists. The facade of the elegant, poised bride had completely evaporated, revealing the spoiled, vicious child she had always been. "You are ruining my night," she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You ruin everything you touch. You could not keep your husband from sleeping with your best friend, and you could not keep your federal job because you are a pathetic, incompetent fraud." The silence in the ballroom was absolute and suffocating. Hundreds of elite guests watched with morbid fascination as the bride threw a massive, unhinged public tantrum. Courtney stormed over to the small stage where the band was seated. She snatched the microphone from the stand, the speakers emitting a harsh feedback loop. She turned back to face me, gripping the microphone tightly. "Look at her," Courtney announced, her voice booming through the surround sound speakers, dripping with venom and malicious glee. "Look at my perfect self, righteous older sister. She has spent her entire life judging me, acting like she is so much better than everyone else. And look at her now. She is a bitter, jealous failure. She embezzled millions of dollars from our father's dealership, and now she is trying to drag my wedding down into the mud because she is terrified of going to federal prison." I stood motionless under the bright chandelier lights, letting her toxic words wash over me. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply watched my sister publicly execute her own dignity. Before the murmurs of the crowd could swell, Helen pushed her way through the throng of guests. She walked straight to the gift table, which was piled high with wrapped boxes and silver ribbons. In her hand, she carried a thick manila folder, the exact same folder Richard had presented to me in his office. She slammed the folder down onto the white linen tablecloth. The heavy thud echoed sharply in the silent ballroom. Helen opened the cover, revealing the forged confession document and the liability waivers they had fabricated with my forged signature. "You brought this on yourself, Diana," Helen declared, her voice projecting clearly to the audience gathered around us. "You forced us to take this drastic measure. We tried to handle your criminal behavior quietly, but since you insist on making a spectacle of yourself in front of our friends and colleagues, we will resolve this right now." Richard appeared beside her, crossing his arms over his chest, his bulky frame intended to intimidate me into compliance. He glared at me with cold, calculating eyes, silently warning me that any further resistance would result in my absolute destruction. "This is your final chance to do the right thing," Helen demanded, tapping a manicured fingernail against the thick stack of paper. "You have disgraced this family enough. Sign the confession, Diana. Admit to the embezzlement. Take responsibility for your own failures and save the family's honor before the federal marshals drag you out of here in handcuffs tomorrow. The collective gaze of the high society crowd bore down on me. I could feel their judgment, their eager anticipation of my complete humiliation. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the disgraced, jealous sister to burst into tears, sign her life away, and flee into the night. Helen held out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, her eyes challenging me to refuse her public ultimatum. I slowly walked over to the gift table. My footsteps were steady, unhurried, and completely devoid of fear. I looked down at the forged confession, reading the fabricated legal jargon designed to steal my freedom and protect the true criminals in the room. I felt the comforting weight of the mobile phone in my pocket. The digital keys to Arthur Vance's criminal empire were sitting right there, ready to be unleashed. I reached out and took the gold-plated pen from my mother's outstretched hand. I looked at Helen's triumphant, sneering face. Then I turned to look at Courtney, who was still clutching the microphone on the stage, a vicious smile playing on her lips. Finally, I swept my gaze across the mocking, judgmental crowd of elite guests who thought they were witnessing my ultimate defeat. "I will sign it," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the silent ballroom. "But I think everyone here should see exactly what I am taking the fall for." I dropped the pen onto the forged document, turned my back on my mother, and marched directly toward the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. I moved with a measured, deliberate stride across the patterned carpet of the ballroom. The crowd parted around me, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and morbid fascination. They expected a tearful retreat or a screaming match. Instead, I walked with the calm precision of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The audio-visual booth sat on a raised platform tucked into the far corner of the room, flanked by heavy velvet curtains. Two young technicians wearing matching black polo shirts were sitting behind a massive soundboard, chatting casually and scrolling through their phones. They looked up in surprise as I stepped onto the platform and walked directly toward the primary control terminal. "Excuse me," the taller technician said, holding up a hand to block my path. "Guests are not allowed back here. We are about to cue up the photo montage for the bride." I did not break my stride. I stepped around his outstretched arm, my eyes locked on the input deck, connecting the central laptop to the room's primary projection system. "I need to make a slight adjustment to the presentation," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and projecting absolute authority. The second technician stood up, moving to shield the laptop. "You cannot touch that equipment, lady. I am going to have to call security if you do not step down right now." I reached into the pocket of my black dress and pulled out my mirrored device. I looked the young man dead in the eye. "I am a federal intelligence officer conducting an active investigation into wire fraud," I stated smoothly. "You can either step aside and let me do my job, or you can explain to the federal marshals tomorrow morning why you obstructed an ongoing operation." The two technicians froze, exchanging a panicked glance. They were college kids working a weekend gig, entirely unequipped to handle a federal threat. They slowly backed away, raising their hands in surrender. I stepped up to the control board and quickly surveyed the setup. The system was locked behind a venue administrative password. I did not have time to run a brute force decryption program. Instead, I bypassed their laptop entirely. I unhooked the primary high-definition multimedia interface cable from the side of their machine and plugged it directly into a small adapter attached to my secure phone. The screen on my device flickered as it synced with the country club network. I tapped the screen, opening the encrypted tunnel I had established just minutes ago in the VIP lounge. The ballroom dimmed as the automated lighting system responded to the visual input, preparing for Courtney's highly anticipated childhood photo montage. 4 massive 80-inch projection screens slowly descended from the ceiling, positioned strategically around the perimeter of the room, so every single guest had a perfect view. The soft, sentimental instrumental music faded out, replaced by a low hum of static. A hush fell over the crowd. People turned in their seats, holding their champagne flutes, waiting to coo over pictures of Courtney in her ballet tutus and high school cheerleading uniforms. I swiped my finger across my screen, selecting the master file labeled Vance Financial Routing. The four massive screens instantly blazed to life. There were no baby pictures, there were no smiling family portraits. Instead, stark high-contrast forensic spreadsheets illuminated the darkened ballroom. Rows and columns of raw financial data glared down at the high society guests. I tapped my screen again, magnifying the top left quadrant of the spreadsheet. The name of my father's dealership appeared in bold red letters alongside a column of sequential wire transfers. Next to that column, I projected the matching offshore account numbers in the Cayman Islands. A collective gasp rippled through the room as the guests stared at the millions of dollars systematically drained from the company accounts. But I was not finished. I swiped to the next file and displayed the dealership's hidden ledgers, phantom service invoices, inflated vehicle sales, and fabricated vendor payouts. The record showed exactly how Richard had prepared to absorb and disguise the stolen money once Greg's transfer arrived. Every transaction connected Greg's holding accounts to Richard's failing dealership. But the person who had financed and directed the larger operation remained hidden behind a coded investor designation. For the moment, I allowed that name to remain concealed. The ballroom erupted into chaos. Shocked whispers turned into loud, frantic conversations. People pointed at the screens, their eyes wide with disbelief, as they processed the magnitude of the corruption displayed before them. The facade of the perfect, untouchable Vance family was disintegrating in real time. I looked toward the front of the room. Judge Arthur Vance stood completely frozen at his table, the color draining from his face as he stared at his own hidden financial directives, broadcast for his peers to see. Courtney let out a piercing, hysterical scream, dropping her microphone onto the floor. Richard broke from his paralyzed stance near the gift table. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, violent rage. He realized exactly what was happening and charged across the ballroom, shoving guests out of his way with brutal force. "Shut it down!" Richard roared, his voice echoing over the mounting panic in the room. "Shut that screen down right now!" He reached the edge of the platform and lunged toward the audiovisual booth, his large hands reaching desperately for the thick cluster of cables connecting my device to the main system. He intended to physically rip the wires out of the wall and plunge the room into darkness. But I had anticipated his violent reaction. I smoothly stepped back, shielding my phone with my body, and tapped the final file in my forensic sequence. The visual presentation on the screen suddenly vanished, replaced by a solid black background holding a single pulsating audio waveform graphic. I bypassed the visual feed and maximized the volume on the master soundboard, pushing the sliders all the way to the top limit. Just as Richard grabbed the edge of the control table, a voice blasted through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. It was Amber, her tone, shrill, frantic, and unmistakably panicked. The audio from her desperate phone call to me in my kitchen filled the cavernous ballroom, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and the mahogany walls. Greg framed Diana Amber's recorded voice said through the speakers. He told me the money was going offshore and that Diana would take the fall. I am willing to testify to everything he told me about the accounts, the forged documents, and the people helping him. Richard froze, his hands trembling inches from the audio cables, pale with sudden, complete terror. I kept the volume at its absolute maximum as the final devastating piece of the recording played. "Judge Vance is protecting his own son's family wealth," Diana Amber's voice confessed to the horrified audience. "He is using his judicial power to coordinate the lawsuit, the security clearance suspension, and your upcoming criminal indictment." I looked directly down at him, and then simply smiled. The silence that followed my smile was heavy and absolute. For several long seconds, no one in the expansive ballroom dared to move or breathe. Then a collective, horrified gasp rippled through the sea of high society guests. Women covered their mouths with manicured hands, and men in expensive tuxedos shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between my father and the giant projection screens above. Richard stood frozen at the edge of the audio-visual platform, his large hands still hovering uselessly near the bundle of cables he had tried to rip from the wall. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and old. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some booming authoritative denial, but the words died in his throat. He had no defense against the undeniable sound of his accomplice weeping over the speakers. I did not give him a chance to recover his wits. I reached across the main soundboard and picked up the spare wireless microphone resting next to the primary monitor. I clicked it on the small green light confirming it was live, and stepped forward to the edge of the elevated platform. I looked out over the crowd of elite judges, politicians, and corporate titans who had spent the last hour judging my simple black dress and whispering about my supposed criminal behavior. "Good evening again, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly through the room, cutting through the rising tide of panicked murmurs. "I apologize for interrupting the scheduled childhood photo montage, but I thought it was incredibly important to clear the air before my sister officially married into your esteemed ranks. You have all been told a very specific, very carefully crafted story over the past few weeks. You have been told that I am a jealous, bitter woman who embezzled $4.5 million to finance a secret life. You have been told that my family is bravely dealing with the tragedy of my criminal downfall. Tonight, I am going to tell you the truth." I raised the microphone and looked across the stunned ballroom. "Here is the truth," I said. "Greg stole the $4.5 million. Richard prepared his dealership to conceal and launder the funds. Helen forged documents and spread the story that I was mentally unstable. Together they planned to leave me facing the federal charges while they kept the money and protected their social standing." I pointed toward the screens as the matching transfer signatures and timestamps appeared behind me. But they did not act alone. Someone with far more power turned their lies into lawsuits, warrants, and a planned federal indictment. Richard tried to protest, but the transaction records behind me rendered his denial meaningless. Helen stood frozen beside the forged confession. Courtney screamed that I was destroying her wedding, yet no one in the room looked at her with sympathy. The guests finally understood that I had not ruined the celebration. The celebration itself had been funded and protected by a criminal conspiracy. I turned toward Carter and Judge Vance. The ballroom fell silent. The most important evidence had not yet appeared. I tapped the glowing screen of my mirrored device, closing the audio file, and opening the final folder I had successfully extracted from the VIP Lounge network. I raised the microphone back to my lips again, feeling the solid weight of total victory. "And for the main event," I announced, letting a cold smile spread across my face. The massive projection screens flickered suddenly, displaying the freshly cloned emails pulled directly from the phone belonging to Courtney's beloved, arrogant fiancé. I magnified the specific text so the entire room could easily read the undeniable proof of their absolute corruption for themselves. The highly encrypted emails clearly show the powerful judge giving his specific direct orders to quietly coordinate the grand jury and permanently frame Diana for the massive embezzlement to completely protect his own family legacy forever. Carter Vance stared up at the massive projection screens, his aristocratic face draining of all color. The arrogant, untouchable sneer he had worn just an hour ago in the private cigar lounge was completely gone. In its place was the frantic, wide-eyed look of a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. He took a stumbling, uncoordinated step forward, raising a violently trembling hand toward the projected images of his own emails. "Those are fabricated!" Carter shouted, his voice cracking with raw desperation as it echoed across the cavernous ballroom. "She is a criminal hacker. She manufactured these documents to frame us because she is guilty. Do not listen to a single word she says. It is entirely fake data." I did not even need to speak to counter his pathetic, transparent lies. I simply tapped the control interface on my mirrored device once more. The display on the four 80-inch screens instantly shifted, zooming in closely on the granular metadata embedded within the email headers. I highlighted the digital routing signatures, the server timestamp verifications, and the highly secure domain key protocols. To the corporate executives, investment bankers, and high-powered attorneys standing in the stunned crowd, this was not just text on a screen. This was irrefutable cryptographic proof of federal crimes. The digital handshake could not be faked, and every single educated professional in that room knew it instinctively. Carter realized the crowd was silently reading the verification codes. He looked frantically at the influential men he had been drinking expensive scotch with earlier that evening. "Gentlemen, you know me," Carter pleaded, his voice climbing an octave into a hysterical whine. "You know my father. This is a malicious cyber attack by a deeply deranged woman. You cannot possibly believe this garbage." But the response from the elite guests was a deafening, condemning silence. The very people who had spent the entire evening toasting to the Vance family's impeccable pedigree and social standing were now physically recoiling. I watched with quiet satisfaction as a prominent state senator leaned over and whispered something urgent into his wife's ear. Without a word, they turned and began walking briskly toward the coat check. A rapid ripple effect immediately tore through the ballroom. The wealthy socialites, the corporate titans, and the political power brokers began taking slow, deliberate steps backward, putting physical distance between themselves and the disgraced family. No one wanted to be caught in the immediate blast radius of a massive federal corruption scandal. The Vance family just moments ago, the absolute pinnacle of local high society, was suddenly toxic. The social shunning was happening in real time. A brutal and immediate excommunication from the elite circles they had ruled with impunity for decades. Courtney watched the influential guests pulling away, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The reality of her crumbling fairy tale wedding was finally penetrating her deeply self-absorbed delusion. She turned to her fiancé, reaching out with both hands to grab the lapels of his expensive charcoal bespoke suit. "Carter, do something," Courtney cried out, her voice a shrill, ear-piercing shriek that made several nearby guests wince. "Tell them it is a lie. Tell them we are still getting married. Make them stay here and celebrate us." Carter looked down at her as if he had absolutely no idea who she was. The polished, devoted, loving partner act vanished instantly, replaced by the selfish, ruthless coward he truly was. He grabbed Courtney by her wrists and violently wrenched her manicured hands off his jacket. "Get away from me, you complete idiot!" Carter snarled, completely unconcerned with who heard his vicious tone. "Your incredibly stupid, greedy family dragged me into this mess. I am not going down for your father's amateur money laundering scheme just to save your feelings." Courtney gasped, stumbling backward from the forceful shove. She nearly tripped over the heavy beaded hem of her expensive designer gown, catching herself awkwardly on a nearby banquet chair to avoid falling to the floor. Carter did not even look back to see if his bride-to-be had fallen. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the side exit leading to the kitchen corridors, shoving past a group of terrified catering waiters in a desperate, cowardly bid to escape the building before the authorities inevitably arrived. With his son fleeing the room in disgrace and the high society guests heading for the exit doors, Judge Arthur Vance finally abandoned his frozen posture at the VIP table. He marched forward, his heavy footsteps thudding against the polished wood floor. He bypassed my mother and Richard, entirely treating them like irrelevant collateral damage. He walked straight toward the audio-visual platform where I stood. He did not look panicked like his son. He looked absolutely furious. The cold, calculating jurist had been replaced by an absolutely enraged tyrant who was completely unaccustomed to having his authority challenged or losing control of a narrative. "You have made a catastrophic mistake, young woman." Judge Vance boomed, his deep baritone cutting through the chaotic, frightened murmurs of the fleeing crowd. He stopped at the very base of the platform, glaring up at me with absolute murderous intent in his slate-gray eyes. "You actually think flashing some illegally obtained data on a screen makes you a hero? You have just publicly confessed to corporate espionage, felony wiretapping, and the blatant theft of highly classified digital property." Judge Vance reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his secure mobile phone. He held it up in the air like a weapon, his thumb hovering aggressively over the screen. "I am calling the local police chief right now," he declared, ensuring his powerful voice carried to the remaining guests in a desperate attempt to assert his dwindling authority. "I play golf with the chief every single Sunday. He will have a dozen patrol cars at the front doors of this country club in less than 3 minutes. You are going to be arrested for severe cybercrimes tonight, Diana, And when I am finished leveraging the full crushing weight of the judicial system against you, you will spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life rotting in a maximum security federal prison. I stood on the raised platform, looking down at the arrogant, corrupt judge. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or intimidation. The threats that would have completely paralyzed me just a month ago sounded like nothing more than the desperate, empty rambling of a defeated man who refused to realize the game was already over. I slowly raised my left hand and casually checked the face of my smartwatch. The digital numbers glowed brightly against the dim, dramatic lighting of the silent ballroom. I wouldn't bother calling the local police chief. I said, my voice incredibly calm, remarkably level, and ringing with absolute finality. Right on cue, the massive, heavy oak doors at the grand entrance of the ballroom swung open with a resounding, thunderous crash. Detective Harrison walked in proudly, flanked by a dozen highly trained, heavily armed federal agents. The heavy boots of the federal agents hit the polished hardwood floor in perfect, intimidating unison. The sheer physical presence of a dozen men and women in dark tactical gear completely shattered the delicate, expensive illusion of the country club wedding reception. The elite guests who had just spent the evening sipping premium champagne and gossiping about my supposed criminal behavior now scrambled desperately out of the way. They pressed themselves against the mahogany-paneled walls and huddled behind banquet tables, parting like a terrified sea to let the authorities pass. Nobody wanted to be caught standing too close to the blast radius of a federal raid. Detective Harrison led the formation, his face a mask of absolute unwavering authority. He did not look at the frightened socialites, the cowering politicians, or the panicked country club staff. He marched straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked on the front of the room. Judge Arthur Vance stood his ground for a fraction of a second, his chin raised in a final pathetic display of judicial arrogance. He opened his mouth, perhaps to demand their badge numbers or to threaten Harrison with his powerful political connections. But as the agents fanned out across the room, securing the exits and taking strategic positions, the reality of the situation finally seemed to pierce through his massive ego. His jaw snapped shut, and the color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet ash under the bright ballroom chandeliers. I remained standing on the audio-visual platform, calmly holding my mirrored device. I watched as Detective Harrison walked directly past me without offering so much as a single glance in my direction. He did not ask me to step down, and he did not reach for his handcuffs to arrest the supposed mastermind of the massive embezzlement scheme. Instead, he stopped directly in front of the two men who had orchestrated the entire nightmare. Richard Judge Arthur Vance Harrison announced, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of the law across the cavernous room. You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and the obstruction of a federal investigation. Richard let out a strangled, breathless sound, sounding like a man who had just been punched squarely in the stomach. He took a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the elevated platform, but two federal agents were already there. They grabbed him by his broad shoulders forcefully, turning him around and pinning his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the silent ballroom was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. Judge Vance did not put up a physical fight, but his eyes darted frantically around the room, searching the faces of his wealthy peers for anyone who would intervene. He found only averted gazes and horrified expressions. The influential friends he had relied on to protect his legacy were already treating him like a highly contagious disease. An agent stepped forward, firmly reciting the Miranda rights, as he secured the heavy steel cuffs around the judge's wrists, forever shattering the illusion of his untouchable power. Helen had been standing completely frozen near the beautifully decorated gift table, clutching a small, silver-wrapped wedding present against her chest like a shield. As she watched her husband being physically restrained and treated like a common street criminal, the delicate, perfectly manicured facade she had maintained for her entire life violently cracked. The silver box slipped from her trembling hands, hitting the floor with a loud, hollow thud. She let out a piercing, guttural wail that tore through the quiet room, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive designer gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She crawled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the gasps of the remaining guests, and grabbed the edge of the audio-visual platform right by my feet. "Diana, please!" Helen sobbed, her face completely ruined by streaking mascara and frantic tears. "You have to fix this. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them you did it. You can handle this. We are your family. You cannot let them take your father away. Please, Diana, just tell them you made a terrible mistake." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, the woman who had gladly conspired to destroy my entire life, my career, and my freedom just to protect her lavish lifestyle and her golden child. She was still trying to manipulate me, still expecting me to throw myself on the grenade to save her perfect world. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No anger, no pity, and certainly no obligation. The emotional hold she had wielded over me for my entire existence had completely evaporated. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I did not bend down to help her up from the floor. I simply turned away, silencing the display on my mirrored device. I methodically disconnected the high-definition adapter, wrapped the black cable in a neat coil, and slipped the equipment back into the pocket of my dress. I was packing up my tools because my job here was finally completely finished. Detective Harrison finished coordinating the secure transport of the two disgraced men. Richard and Judge Vance were marched down the center aisle, their heads bowed, surrounded by a tight wall of federal agents. Courtney was weeping hysterically near the overturned wedding cake, completely ignored by everyone, including her fleeing groom. The ballroom, once a symbol of immense wealth and untouchable power, was now just a massive crime scene. Harrison turned and walked slowly back toward the platform, stopping just a few feet away from where Helen was still weeping inconsolably on the floor. He looked up at me, his professional demeanor softening into a look of deep, genuine respect. He reached into the inner pocket of his dark tactical jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of official paper. "We just received this through the encrypted secure channel about 10 minutes ago," Harrison said, keeping his voice low so only I could hear the classified details. He extended his arm, handing the crisp white paper across the edge of the platform. I took the document, unfolding it carefully. It was a formal, heavily coded dispatch from the International Task Force. I scanned the brief, deeply satisfying text. It was a decrypted urgent message directly from the Mexican federal authorities. Greg and Amber had not made it to their tropical paradise. They had not successfully vanished into the shadows with their stolen millions. The dispatch stated that they had both been apprehended just an hour ago. They were forcefully pulled from a private transport vehicle by armed border police while attempting to cross the southern border using poorly fabricated, incredibly cheap forged passports. I slowly read the final official confirmation line detailing their immediate permanent transfer to a highly secure federal holding facility where they were currently awaiting their swift, inevitable extradition back to the United States. I handed the dispatch back to Detective Harrison and left the ruined country club without looking behind me. For the first time in my life, I felt no need to rescue the people who had betrayed me or remain long enough to witness their collapse. The consequences belonged to them now. Over the following months, my name was cleared, my security clearance was restored, and the federal agency offered me a promotion. I declined it. After everything that had happened, I no longer wanted my future controlled by an institution that had abandoned me the moment a powerful family told a convincing lie. Within a year, the bitter winter had melted into a vibrant Chicago summer. The passage of time did not dull my sharp edge, but rather honed it into a purposeful driving ambition. I had walked away from the federal agency, refusing to return to an institution that had demanded my absolute loyalty while offering none in return. Instead, I poured every ounce of my energy, my expertise, and my newly acquired settlement funds into building my own enterprise. I launched Sterling Forensic Group, a premier independent auditing firm specializing in corporate fraud and digital asset recovery. Building the firm from the ground up was grueling, exhausting work, but it was the most incredibly rewarding experience of my entire life. I was no longer a disposable asset in someone else's grand corporate or federal machine. I handpicked my team, recruiting the sharpest, most relentless financial investigators and cybersecurity experts in the Midwest. We did not answer to bureaucrats, and we certainly did not cater to the delicate egos of corrupt executives. We hunted hidden money, and we were terrifyingly good at it. The ultimate validation of my new path arrived just last week. My receptionist informed me that a prominent delegation was waiting in our main conference room. When I walked through the double glass doors, I was greeted by the regional director of my former federal agency, the very same man who had offered me a promotion right before I resigned. He did not look smug or authoritative. He looked desperate. The agency was dealing with a massive, highly sophisticated offshore embezzlement case that their internal teams could not crack. They needed an outside consultant with an absolutely flawless track record and an unmatched understanding of encrypted international wire transfers. They needed the very woman they had once suspended. I sat at the head of the conference table and listened to their pitch. When the director finished outlining the complex parameters of the investigation, he pushed a highly lucrative multi-million-dollar contract across the table. My first major anchor client as an independent firm was the very federal agency that had investigated Greg and suspended my clearance. I dictated my own terms, established my own unyielding boundaries, and signed the contract with a profound sense of absolute triumph. That sense of total victory carried over to my personal life. I am currently standing on the sprawling private balcony of my new penthouse apartment in the heart of downtown Chicago. The evening air is warm and heavy, carrying the distant ambient hum of city traffic and the faint sound of music from a rooftop bar down the street. The magnificent city skyline stretches out before me, a glittering sea of towering glass and steel illuminated against the darkening sky. I run my hand along the smooth, cool metal of the balcony railing, taking a deep breath of the summer air. This penthouse is not just a beautiful place to live. It is a tangible, monumental symbol of my absolute independence. Every single square foot of this incredible space, from the floor to ceiling windows to the custom marble kitchen, is completely paid off. There is no mortgage, no bank loan, and absolutely no financial leverage that anyone can ever use against me. I own my life outright. Looking down at the busy streets below, I feel completely untouchable. The fear and anxiety that used to dictate my every waking moment have been entirely eradicated. I no longer spend my days wondering how to please a mother who fundamentally resented me, or how to seek the approval of a father who viewed me as nothing more than a convenient disposable pawn in his own criminal schemes. The psychological chains they had wrapped around my mind for 34 years are gone, leaving me with a fierce, quiet clarity. The people who tried to destroy me have been completely consumed by the consequences of their own monstrous actions. Richard is currently sitting in a federal penitentiary, his once booming voice and intimidating presence reduced to a prisoner identification number. His beloved dealership was auctioned off piece by piece, the profits seized by the government, to cover the staggering debts of his sophisticated money laundering operation. Helen and Courtney, stripped of their stolen wealth and their precious vital social status, are living a life they used to mock. The grand mansion is gone, replaced by a tiny run-down two-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The high society friends who used to drink their premium champagne have entirely forgotten their names. Greg is serving a lengthy federal sentence for wire fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, and obstruction. Amber received a reduced sentence after agreeing to testify, but her cooperation did not erase her role in the theft, the forged passports, or the attempt to frame me. I am miles away from their misery, both physically and emotionally. I do not wish them further harm, but I also do not spare them a single ounce of my pity. They earned their destruction just as I earned my freedom. I take a sip from the glass of expensive red wine I am holding, letting the rich, complex flavors ground me in the present moment. I am safe, I am successful, I am deeply, profoundly at peace. Suddenly, the sharp buzz of my mobile phone vibrating against the glass patio table shatters the quiet tranquility of the evening. I lower my wine glass and pick up the device, glancing down at the brightly illuminated screen. It is a frantic, rambling text message from Courtney. The block of panicked text details a pathetic emergency. She is desperately begging me for a substantial cash loan to pay their monthly rent. The message explains with remarkable lack of self-awareness that Helen just blew the absolute last bit of their remaining cash reserves, frantically trying to maintain her exclusive country club membership. I look at the desperate message, reading the words twice to truly absorb the staggering magnitude of their unyielding delusion. I do not feel a single flicker of guilt. I tap the screen and quickly type two simple words in response. Good luck. I press send, instantly, block the number forever, and carelessly toss the mobile phone onto the plush cushions of the outdoor sofa. I slowly turn back to admire the breathtaking, glittering city skyline, breathing very deeply, finally at peace. True security began the moment I stopped asking toxic people to validate my worth. Family loyalty does not require surrendering your safety, freedom, or future to protect those who chose to betray you. I learned that boundaries are not cruelty, and walking away is not failure. Sometimes the only way to reclaim your life is to stop rescuing the people who engineered your destruction and allow the consequences to reach them. Peace is not found by finally winning their approval. It is built by trusting yourself, protecting what you have earned, and refusing to return to a game designed for you to lose. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment or set firm boundaries with people who tried to bring you down? Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments below. If this story of reclaiming independence and demanding justice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more journeys of resilience and taking back control. Remember, your peace is always worth protecting.